Pablo Escobar once famously said, "The only man I was ever afraid of was a woman named Griselda Blanco." But to understand that fear, you don't look at the cocaine godmother who ruled Miami in the 80s. You look at the forgotten child who made her. The accepted narrative says Griselda Blanco was a monster who climbed her way to the top. But monsters are not born, they are created. And for Griselda, that creation moment came not at the height of her power, but in the grime and chaos of her childhood. It came when she was around 11 years old, a time when she allegedly committed her first murder. But here is the twist. The true origin of her legendary ruthlessness isn't just the killing of a kidnapped child, as the story often goes. The true origin is the unseen 13-year-old street punk and his small, brutal gang who showed a younger Griselda the first lessons in extortion, cold-blooded violence, and how to operate without a soul. This is the origin story that reveals the terrifying mechanics of the godmother's mind. To understand Griselda, you must first understand Medellin in the 1940s and 50s. She was born in 1943, and by the age of 3, she was living with her mother, Ana Lucia Restrepo, in the city of Medellin. This was a city already boiling with violence, economic disparity, and a pervasive culture of survivalism. Griselda's mother was a sex worker. Her home life was one of chronic abuse, neglect, and trauma. Griselda ran away from home, likely around the age of 9 or 10, trading one brutal environment for another. The streets of Medellin were a constant, unforgiving apprenticeship in crime. It was here, among other children living rough, that Griselda learned the essential tools of her trade: pickpocketing, shaking down small-time merchants, and petty theft. She was short, barely 5 feet tall, but she was already displaying the ferocious temperament that would later make Pablo Escobar fear her. In this environment, crime wasn't a choice. It was the ultimate form of self-actualization. It was the only way to meet her basic needs. And the fastest way to succeed on the streets was to be the most ruthless. This is where the story of the 13-year-old begins. The story of Griselda's first murder is a core piece of her legend. The details are grim but consistent across multiple accounts. The victim was a 10-year-old boy from a wealthy family living in a neighborhood bordering Griselda's slum. Griselda, only 11 years old herself, was allegedly part of a group of older street youths who planned the kidnapping. This detail is crucial. She was not the mastermind. She was a member of a gang. And in that gang, she was likely mentored by a boy who was 2 or 3 years older, old enough to have mastered the street code, old enough to own a weapon. The goal was simple: ransom. They took the boy and waited for the payment. But the victim's family, perhaps due to police interference or simply underestimating the seriousness of the situation, failed to pay the ransom in time. What happened next wasn't the act of a scared child. It was the calculated execution of a business decision. The boy was shot and killed, and according to some biographers, the fatal shot was fired by Griselda. This act, the shocking efficiency of it, is what cemented Griselda's future. In the context of the street, this wasn't just murder, it was a declaration. This child is serious. This child is capable of anything. It taught her 3 principles that would define her empire. 1. Enforcement is everything. A threat is worthless without the will to follow through. 2. Paranoia is protection. Trust no one, especially not those who owe you. 3. The only man you fear is yourself. The men around her, the older boys, saw her fire and either feared it or were attracted to it. This early incident was her true apprenticeship in the psychology of violence. She learned from the older gang members that fear was the only currency that mattered. While the child who may have led that initial gang fades into the anonymity of Medellin's past, the official historical record points directly to Griselda's next mentor, the man who would become her first husband, Carlos Trujillo. She was just 13 years old when she took up with him. Trujillo was a small-time criminal, a coyote who smuggled illegal immigrants into the United States, and a forger who specialized in fake documents. In a city where crime was the biggest industry, Trujillo was a low-level manager, but to a young girl who'd survived on her own since age 9, he was stability, a system, and a doorway. Trujillo introduced her to the logistics of international crime. It wasn't about the quick-grab pickpocketing anymore. It was about routes, papers, and deception. She was a quick study using her intelligence and her shocking capacity for violence to quickly move up the ranks of Trujillo's operation. She married him, and they had 3 sons together, Dixon, Uber, and Osvaldo. But the domestic stability was an illusion. When you build an empire on fear, the threat must always come from the top. Accounts suggest Griselda grew dissatisfied. She saw Trujillo's small-time hustles as beneath her. She was clearly the more ambitious and, critically, the more ruthless partner. Their relationship soured over business. According to widespread legend, when Trujillo crossed her, or perhaps just ceased to be useful, Griselda had him murdered in 1970. This first husband's death was the first of the infamous Black Widow murders, but it was Trujillo's lessons in logistics and document fraud that laid the groundwork for the future. He taught her how to build a fake identity, an ability she would use for decades to evade the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. Now, to say, if Carlos Trujillo taught Griselda the how of international crime, her second husband, Alberto Bravo, taught her the, what? Cocaine. In the late 1960s, marijuana was still the major drug of choice in the U.S. Bravo was a mid-level cocaine smuggler for the emerging Medellin cartel. When Griselda met him and saw the immense profit margins of cocaine, she knew this was the vehicle for the empire she was meant to build. In the early 1970s, Griselda and Bravo moved to Queens, New York, where they set up shop. This is where Griselda's street-honed ruthlessness met the big leagues. Griselda's genius was her innovation. She recognized that the male-dominated customs and security teams were looking for men. She realized a woman, especially a discreet one, could bypass scrutiny. Her revolutionary idea: custom-made lingerie with hidden compartments designed to carry kilos of cocaine, worn by female mules. This seemingly simple idea transformed the entire smuggling operation. It was a massive, scalable logistical leap. While Bravo handled the supply in Colombia, Griselda managed the distribution network in the U.S. using the same paranoia and zero-tolerance enforcement philosophy she learned on the streets as a child. This partnership established her first multi-million-dollar business. But like Trujillo, Bravo eventually became a liability. By 1975, facing indictments in the U.S., the couple fled back to Colombia. The final confrontation between Griselda and Bravo took place in a Bogota nightclub parking lot. It wasn't an argument, it was a shootout. Griselda was wounded, but when the smoke cleared, Bravo and 6 of his bodyguards were dead. Griselda, now the Black Widow, had eliminated the only person standing between her and total control of the operation. She shot her way to the top. By the late 1970s, Griselda Blanco was in Miami, and the empire was running on pure adrenaline and blood. She was no longer just a trafficker, she was the godmother of cocaine. The same brutality she displayed as an 11-year-old child who executed a kidnapping victim was now a billion-dollar business model. Her philosophy, which took root when she was just a child in a Medellin slum, translated perfectly to the cocaine cowboy wars. Zero tolerance for debt. Anyone who failed to pay a debt was to be killed immediately, often in public, and with extreme violence to send a clear message. The motorcycle hitman. An invention of Griselda's. 2 gunmen on a motorcycle. A clean, fast, and terrifyingly efficient way to carry out a drive-by assassination and escape through congested city streets. The accidental kill. Griselda was suspected of dozens of murders, but the case that truly chilled the world was the murder of 2-year-old Johnny Castro, an accidental casualty in a hit job on his father, a rival drug dealer. Her reaction to the news? She was allegedly glad, because they were even. The child's life was simply a cost of doing business. This cold, utilitarian violence wasn't something she learned in a boardroom. It was the survival tactic she learned on the streets from the time she was a child. The lessons she learned from that 13-year-old street punk were not forgotten. They were simply scaled up to a multi-billion-dollar operation. Griselda Blanco's legacy is often simplified to a woman who dominated a man's world. But the true horror lies in her beginning. Her alleged first murder at 11 was not a random act of juvenile delinquency. It was a graduation from a harsh school of survival, likely guided by older, unseen hands who taught her the price of a life. It was this foundational cold-blooded violence, the willingness to kill a child for a failed ransom learned at the feet of a street gang, that allowed her to terrify Pablo Escobar, conquer New York, and flood Miami with cocaine. And in the end, it was her own invention, the motorcycle hitman, that brought her violent reign to an end. In 2012, Griselda Blanco was gunned down outside a butcher shop in Medellin. She died the same way she taught others to live, violently, abruptly, and without mercy. Let me know in the comments below, do you believe Griselda was born a monster, or was she simply the most efficient product of the brutal environment she was forced to survive? Hit the like button, subscribe for more deep dives into the true history of the narco wars, and check out the video on screen now for the full story of the Cocaine Cowboys.